Okay, planning. Let's make it easy. This should take like 3 minutes. Like it's only 24 processes and the most important thing in the world. Talk to me about what's confusing to you about planning, please.
The order of things. So there's like you said, there are 24 items, if you will, on this list, or activities. Are they happening at the same time? I know some of them have dependencies on the others. I don't understand how this all works together, because there are so many different things. And are they happening, like I said, are they happening at the same time? Does it happen in order down the list? That doesn't make sense to me. I know you separated it from the how group. You've got the how group and the what group, which makes sense. But again, do you do the how group first and then the what group? Do you, all of that? Yeah.
Okay.
All of what you wrote.
There we go. All right, so we have it. Same time, top to bottom, maybe. What's how and what? I see a lot of things. Who knows if I even remember. Dependencies, what's going on? All right, let's go back. All right, so planning process group. Like, let me just understand for your, like, why do we do it? In your opinion? Like,
I mean, you have to plan. If you don't plan how you're going to do things, you basically won't get anything done. So you have to plan for everything.
Must plan for how? Because it must plan for how? Because you'll end up things will be worse, right? People don't know what to do, whatever. Yeah. So the first thing is the planning process that we're talking about here is in traditional waterfall projects. So build a big bridge, do a regular project, heavy planning up front. That's why of these 49 processes, 24 half-ish are right there. A lot of planning up front. So the method of planning, the thought process that we do, in a sense, is not different in Agile and Waterfall. Just go through saying. But the depth that we do it is different. And so let's just talk about the Waterfall stuff. We can talk about Agile planning, which is, I think, a more fun way to talk. But okay, so what we plan for how we're going to do it. So you said how. Why did you choose the word plan for how we're going to do the project? Why did you choose the word how?
Well, because it's how will we, well, it's not just how, it's what, what is the schedule? What is the cost? How will we communicate? How will we identify and respond to risks? How will we check quality? How will we know the project is done or deliverables are accepted? So I guess to me, the bulk of it is how. There are a lot of hows.
Yeah, and then the what is the what? What's the what? And I'll ask you
what are the resources? What do we need? What will it cost? What time will it take? Or what's the schedule look like? What will it need? Yeah. What will we need? What is the time? What will it cost?
Yeah, schedule, stuff like that. And then there's another question that's pretty important, that kind of kicks it all off. If you ask them criticality, what we're doing first, what's the only thing that matters in life?
Value.
Yeah, getting stuff done. At the end of the day, we building a doghouse, or we building the Dalai Lama doghouse? I don't know if that's a thing, but we building a fancy pants thing, or we building a rickety thing? Maybe the key what is what are we delivering?
Okay.
That's the what that starts it all. The what that launched 1,000 ships. In a sense, this is the Cleopatra of what's. All right. And so what the Cleopatra of what's she was the person that launched 1,000 ships. Is that right?
Wasn't that Helen?
I don't know. Google it, everybody. I don't know.
That was Helen, maybe.
Didn't do good in history. We want to start with what are we delivering? And then like all that will the ramifications as we're understanding that, like I want to do a lot of stuff. What I can do is a different story. So it all starts with the charter, what they say we got to do. And we have a pretty good idea. And then that is where we take the high level from the charter and we get down to the nitty gritty of like, all right, this is what we will do. That's that first question, boop, that the team must take on. Because the natural first question is like if you got a team and they're raring to go, what is the first thing that they want to do?
They want to get to work.
Yeah, they want to do things.
Right. Let's go do some
Bricklayers
stuff.
want to lay bricks.
Right.
But like, we got to go, whoa. Let's figure out all the details around it. Like,
right.
How big's the house? Like, what specifically in there? Like, what all the devil's in those details. So
right.
We're starting to like, what are we delivering? And let's understand it, taste it, feel it 3-dimensional wise. Then it all the ramifications come. So that's pretty cool. Okay. So if we start with that and we go, let's redraw this thing. We're starting in planning. We got the integration stuff that's pulling it all together. And then there's the scope. So let's just start right at the top. Now, I know I said I made up that the Cleopatra, like the thing that launches everything is like, what are we doing? So like, that's like, what are we doing? That's like in the scope thing. And we're going to iterate that through. There's processes there. Now, like while we're doing that, it's super duper important to like jump right up. And maybe we do this first, maybe we do it with it. Don't like overthink it, but like, it's like, how are we going to manage this big thing? Like how we managing or dictating everything. And that could be like a ginormous question. It could be like, oh God, I could think forever on that. But like, really, it's like, okay, so we're getting ready to jump into scope. Like, first of all, like, how are we going to do it? How are we going to integrate it with costs? When are we going to bring in costs? And like, don't get too deep. Like, just think high level, like, okay, we're going to do this first. Then we're going to bring in these guys as we get into it. And we got to make sure that we evaluate the cost and the schedule while we're doing it, because that's the only way we can really understand what's possible. So like how we're going to integrate all these things together theoretically is like we start up here. And that's called like, what's the thing, the plan that brings all the plans together is called the what?
The project management plan.
Yeah. Like that's the big one. PMP,
yes.
Project management. And then every one of these little areas, scope, schedule, cost, whatever, has like a micro plan, right? Like
correct.
And that's called like what? Like the subsidiary
scope management plan. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. Like the scope management plan. It's basically like name knowledge area, like management
plan.
And the way we want to think about that is we always want to think about like, how would we define that? Like when scope management plan, it's our blah, blah, blah. Like how would you simplify that with meeting for me? What's the purpose of that thing? Like a knowledge area management plan? Like,
I mean, it's just, see, that's where I guess I'm being very literal. Like a management plan tells me how I'm managing the scope, right? So what?
Yes.
Okay.
Literal paid off.
Okay.
How we're gonna do it in scope.
Okay.
Like, let's get into like as we sit down and go like, okay. Like, are we just going like this dude thinks it's the thing we do, so we do it? Is that our scope thing? No. We're gonna bring in the dudes and dudettes. They're gonna put our ideas down. We're going to evaluate them across this criteria. We're going to slim them down to here. We're going to make sure that we check costs and stuff like that. We're going to make a decision based off this kind of thing. We're going to have this dude approve or dudette approve. We're going to nail it down. Then shoot, like it seems tough to get it actually just nailed down, but it's important because we don't want to build a Golden Gate Bridge that's this wide or this wide or this. Like, okay, that's important. How are we going to know if we actually did it? Oh, shoot. We got to think about that now. Do we have the right people? When are they going to do it? All that. You're just thinking about it like, okay. You're thinking like long-term, like how now and how then. Like, how are we going to check? How are we going to do it? How are we going to check it? And you're like, okay, I understand. And you might be able to show people to be like, yo, this is how we're going to break this scope down. This is how we're going to check it. If I die, here's what we do. You cool?
So this
Sweet.
is setting the stage for execution and monitoring and controlling.
It's setting the stage for all the games. Like it's setting the
Okay.
stage for planning. Okay, now we got to break the scope down. We already talked about how we're going to do it. Sweet. It's setting the stage for like when we go out there, how we're going to get it done. It's setting the stage for how we're going to check it. It's how we're going to formally close it out. So it's setting our stage so we know
Okay.
basically what's going to happen. Not
Right.
the devil's in the deep. What's going to happen?
Okay. Wow.
It's
All
like
right.
it feels like something may have clicked in your brain.
Oh my gosh, light bulbs everywhere. Are you kidding
Sweet.
me? Yeah.
We're gonna call this the light bulb series.
Yeah.
And so that's good. So as we talk about priority and stuff like that, you got to know kind of like how, like initially, how for all these things. Then we get into the guts of like what, right? So like the plans are the hows, the whats are all the rest of the processes.
Okay.
Now there ain't
And
no way that I can draw them all. It'll take me forever.
no,
And I'm not that clean of stuff.
don't draw
Right?
them all.
I'm not gonna draw them all. But like every one of them, if somebody out there were to look, grab the PMBOK or go to my thing and do the PM1 view thingy, whatever it is, you see all the process. There's always, this is like break your brain stuff in a good way. There's always a plan at the top. Infinitum. And there's like there's 10 things down there. And so these are all the plans, you get it, like the management plan, and that's how we're going to do it. And then the other things are the like what happens, like how we actually produce value in this project, etc. There could be the risk stuff that we broke down, and it's like identify, quantitative, do risk responses. It gets us to the point, like how we deliver on what we're trying to accomplish in planning. So the cool thing is, once we understand the yellows or the hows, like the guides, we can go like this. Oopsie. If you erase even more, ain't no big deal. And so what's left is the rubber meets road junk.
The what?
And somehow I just went white color, which is cool. And so let me think in my mind, like there's only a couple sections in planning that really matter about like how we get into the guts of the project. And you want to put some like names next to these areas. What are these areas?
I mean, when I think of the I guess most important are scope, schedule, and cost.
Dead on.
Okay.
So I'm going to do that. Like I'm going to try to get another pencil. No, I got to get off there. Yeah, that's the big guts of like right off the bat. When we simplify that stuff down, now we go scope, schedule, cost. And we're doing all those things. I'd say those are like the leaders. Like those are setting the pace. Like I think scope is leading the pace. Like now we might be constrained by cost. We only have this much money. We only have this much time. That's going to have ramifications back on what we can deliver. Right? But what starts the game is like what we are going to deliver.
Right.
So nailing those three things down, and there's like a give and take between them all, nails us down to what? What are we producing? What's the goal?
The baselines?
Yeah, the baselines. And they take different forms, right? So like if we go the scope baseline, what are we getting out of there? Like I'll just do a little erasing. Like if we just talk about the scope, like the first one, we'll just go scope. Like, what do we produce? Like, what's the process? Like, how would we go get the scope? We already got a plan for like, oh yeah, well, this one we're going to do it. Like, what are the actual rough steps that we're taking? Like, what's the funnel for that?
To get the scope?
To get the scope baseline, yeah.
I mean, we need to know how you know that it's done, right?
Yeah.
How do you know if it's accepted or done?
I mean, that's like you're thinking with the end in mind, which is nice because like how we know.
Right.
But the first thing is like, let's get lots of ideas there. So let's collect all our requirements, right? Let's get all our, that's, I mean, I could go through the processes, but in a sense, like, let's collect what we could do. We're going to start with like what we could do. Like no ideas are bad, like what we could do. And like, and then as we go deeper into these processes, we're going to go from the could to what we will do. Like, and if we look at these processes, that's what they do. Like each one going down. I'm hesitant to like list them all because it like gets your brain thinking. But in reality, it's just like could to what we will.
Okay. That makes sense. Okay.
And then when we get to the bottom here, obviously we're not just going to run this process down here and go like, now we're going to deliver this house, because the dudes that pay the bills might go like, you ain't. Like, we're not putting like marble on everything. Like there's a give and take with schedule and time. And we might be like, yo, we want to do marble countertops. And they're like, dude, marble, like there's like a 4-month delay. Come up with something else.
Okay.
There's like a back and forth. So what we will do has to play into these other areas.
Schedule and cost. Okay.
Now, the manifestation of that, what does it look like when we get there? Like we have this scope baseline. Like how does that break down? Like, what are the parts of it?
That's the scope statement and the work breakdown structure. Oh my gosh, there's 3 things. The dictionary.
Yeah. So those are the 3 things. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
And so those provide different levels. Like the scope statement is where we take our requirements. We have a requirements documentation. As we're working down here, we're adding details like what would it look like, what success criteria is, all that stuff, who would check it, all that stuff. And we're breaking down into, okay, cool. This is what we are going to deliver. Let's frame it up in a written statement. Like, let's write it down. We are going to deliver this on our project. This is what we're not going to deliver. Here's how we're going to know we're done. All those things so that it's like, why would we do that? Why would we write it down in like paragraph-ish form?
Well, that's what manages your scope creep. So especially if you're saying we're not going to do granite countertops and somebody tries to throw that in, no. That's outside of the scope of the project. So it helps to manage that scope creep.
Yes. So we're nailing down what we will and what we will not do. And so that's beautiful. And it's a clarifying document where people read and go, yep, that's what I see. That's what I agree to. I understand it's not what I want, but I understand that's what we got to do. And it's not going to be as peaceful as that, obviously. People are going to hate us. That's life. We got to manage it. And so as we're doing that, there's different mechanisms to get there. If we think about the requirements development there, we're getting into like, how do we facilitate them? How do we document them? How do we vote? Do we do affinity diagrams? Tons of different methods, but it's all getting down to how do we understand what we want to do? What's the rationale behind it? Goes back to make a big long list, think about it, prioritize it, nail it down. Whether it's a backlog or anything else, requirements documentation, whatever. We're getting down to what we do here. And then the WBS, what is the WBS other than an acronym?
That's your decomposition of your, is it actions, activities?
Ooh, I'm glad you said that word. Because that ain't right, but like, no, it's okay. So this is awesome. And then there are people on the internet machine. I'm not an expert or whatever, technically, but like they do say that like the WBS has like the activities. Like if I always said that is wrong, what does it have in it?
Well, like in my brain, it's like what you're gonna do. But it's hierarchical, right? So you start at the high level and then you break it down, just like what you drew, you know, and it tells you what, like that work package, right? So what you'll do within this box, this is what you do.
Because it does say work, right? It says work, W-O-R-K. And work feels like activities.
Correct.
Right? Like dig a ditch. Like that feels like work. But here's the thing. work ain't work in the way that work is not like what we think about dig the ditch. The work that we're talking about is like what will be there at the end. I could have chose better words. It's like the result.
Right. Okay.
So give me an example of what work is. It ain't dig the ditch. It's what?
Can't use the ditch acronym.
Say it one more time. I misheard.
The ditch. I don't know what the ditch one. Well, let's see. If you're digging a ditch, I don't know why you would be digging a ditch to route your water in a different place.
Dude, the world of ditches is amazing. Like there are ditches for thousands of reasons. I don't know.
Right.
They got to put water. They got to get water to move. The Romans technically had aqueducts, which are just fancy pants ditches. Seem to work for them.
So reroute the water.
Huh?
Reroute the water.
Yeah, that's what they did. They did a good job. I have no idea how they did it. There's some smart people.
Right.
So like in the dig the ditch. What is the work that we're talking about?
Well, the work is what the goal of the digging of the ditch is. So increase capacity. Maybe it's not a big enough of a ditch. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. So you got it. So it's like the actual work that you would say is like the actual ditch that serves a purpose. We're not doing it for fun. We're doing it for a purpose.
Right.
Like, so like something that serves the function and delivers, like the Aqua Duct. They didn't go like there's something like when they're evaluating it, don't think the PMBOK was out when they did the Aqua Duct. Don't think so. Like Lee Lambert's old, but not that old. Like, and so like, it's that like you think about it, like Aqua Duct. Like there's a lot of things like that it's got the right like formation, that it achieves the right purpose, that like we can break it down, all the things that functionally must exist to get that so that the water goes down, like has the right, I don't know, I'm not an engineer anymore, camphor or whatever, it has the right angle here, it has the right materials and all that different stuff, like the functionality that must exist to get it there. So like when the work is done, it's like you're not paying for people to do work. Nobody cares if you work hard. Everybody cares if you do what you get the result that they wanted.
Okay.
That's what they're paying for.
Makes sense.
So the work is what's there.
Okay.
I don't feel like you believe me.
Well, no, it makes sense. Like the work isn't the physical work. It's what the work produces.
Now ditches don't dig themselves.
Not at all.
Not at all. So when we think about that, now that we understand that like the work breakdown structure is like the ditch and all the details of the ditch. Tell me about the ditch, all that stuff, like all those things so that we can break it down. Like, why wouldn't we just say ditch? Like, why would we break it down?
Right. Because the ditch has components. There are things that need to happen for the ditch to happen.
Yes. So be careful, but you're right. Like things that need to happen. Like if we think about a ship, like a ginormous cruise ship, there are different staterooms, there are different engine rooms, there are different functionalities. There are all these things that must be there. So like could be like the engine room, like the entertainment spaces, like, and then we go deeper, like, oh, the propulsion side of it, the cooling side of it, the whatever, the stages, so that like the people that are, producing that have their done visibility of like what done should be there.
Right.
Now, is it good enough to just say, yo, you're building the stage. Here's the picture. Here's the specs. I'll be back in a week. Give me that stage. Do we stop there?
We need to define it so they know what that is, what the expectation is.
Expectation of what? We defined what we want. Is that good enough?
Right. No. What is complete? What will we accept? How do they know when
Right.
it's
And so that's
done?
all scope stuff. We're saying, hey, dude, it's got to be like this. It's got to be whatever. It's got to, I don't know what floor it has to, you know, whatever. I don't know. That's all the characteristics of what the acceptance criteria is. So that's
Okay.
super important. Now, I'm asking dudes and dudettes got to build the stage.
Mhm.
What are we going to do? We've told them like what the end's going to be, what the acceptance criteria is. What else do we need to help them make sure that they're successful in waterfall?
Is that the dictionary?
I'm getting ready to jump down. Like we got the
Yeah.
dictionary. Yeah, the dictionary provides
Is
details.
there? Okay, so we're past that.
So we're good. We've nailed scope. They understand what, you know, all the different rooms are, what the
Oh,
end's going to be
I
like. They know the
see.
ship's going to be beautiful.
So
What's
is this,
next?
are we going into schedule? Like,
I think we are.
when are we doing it? How, put that on the calendar.
Oh yeah. Okay. So put what on the calendar?
What they're doing.
Yeah. Now we get into like the traditional way we think about work. Like, what are the steps? So the schedule is like, what are the steps?
Okay.
So like we take this little, we broke it down. So this is the stage or whatever. They know what it needs to be. Then they go like, okay, let's start with another big list. What do we need to do to deliver the schedule? Well, we got to order materials. We got to get the craftsmen ready. We got to train the people up. We got to frame it up. Then we got to lay it out. Then we got to blah, blah, blah. We got to hit the nails in the head, blah, blah, blah. We got to test it. We got to put a coating on it. I got to wait for it to dry. We got to do whatever. I don't know. So we got a big, long list. Then we go, okay, sweet. Big, long list. It always starts with a big, long list. What's the next question after we got a big, long, some dude just told you everything that needs to happen. What's the next question you would ask him?
We need to put it in order. What needs to happen first?
Right. We say, put it in order. And so then they build like this thing. And it's like, yeah, all together, do this, do that, whatever. You know, cool. You can see how it's going. And then we're done. Stage is done. What's the next question? So what's the order? I know no one in the world will be able to read this. What's the order? Once we have that picture, then
the
it's done. Then we
time.
go, huh?
Time. How much does each thing take?
How long does each take? So I did a terrible job of just scrabbling, but I'll do it like now. Think about that like network diagram, those process in a map. Now it starts to like expand and contract. It looks like it's alive. Things get bigger, things get smaller, things get moved. And you go, okay, now the picture's starting to come together. I can dig this. Let's use a different color. Now we're playing out like what it's actually going to look like. So let's just clear the page. We'll keep going. And so some are long, some are short, you know, whatever. You get the picture, and it goes out and goes what. What do we do then? Like, what might we want to challenge at that point? Like we go, oh shit, like some things are long, some things are short. Like this is when it's going to start. What might we want to think about at that point? Like somebody who said, hey, we're going to launch this ship in June. What do they care about?
We need to make sure that fits into that timeline.
Right. Because it might turn out that's like, oh, if we do it this way, we're not going to be done until August.
Right.
Oh, no. So let's stress test it. And then we go, let's figure this thing out.
Okay.
Then we start to challenge it. So we start to challenge the schedule. This is all in these processes that's what the four processes that they're doing. Bring the scope down. Tell us how we're going to do it. Order it. Bring depth into it with like what it's going to cost, who's going to do it, whatever. We also might go, oh, shoot, the welders, they're already assigned. We're in trouble because we won't have welding capacity during this critical welding time, which is like right here. Oh, no. What are we going to do? hire other welders, shift them off a job, whatever. What we're trying to do is because like we got to find a way to take this thing and go back here so that we meet this deadline.
Okay.
So we're going to push around resources, level, do all these different stuff. We might plan to crash stuff, do things in parallel, really challenge how we're doing it, whatever. But our goal is to get it down so that like the ending thing makes our deadline. That seems good.
Yep.
Then we nail it down. Like we nail it down. That's our schedule. Now, while we're doing that, what are we also figuring out? Like to get to that point, what are we also figuring out? Think of other knowledge areas.
Sure. Well, we're figuring out, oh my gosh. Cost is a big factor, right?
No doubt, because because we might have some conversation, dude, to bring in welders, it's going to cost us out the ears. Is everybody okay with that? Or the person that's paying the bill, are you okay with that? Yeah, we got to get this ship out, or no. And then you're like, oh God. And then like the give and take, well, can we push it a month? And can we do it? So the cost gets nailed down. What else gets nailed down?
I mean, I feel like quality might be affected because if you're adjusting the way you do things, trying to speed them up, or, we want to make sure that we meet whatever quality expectation we have.
Yeah. And we might honestly go like, oh, dude, we didn't think about quality. Where are these quality checks? And we throw them in there. And what does that affect? Like everything, cost, quality, schedule, all these things. Ooh, resources. The other thing is like, we got to have people to do this stuff. So this is like this is an all hands on deck exercise. Because this ship's like a beast. Right. Like I used to work at a shipyard. It's amazing that it gets done. Like I just had a little baby piece and I was trying to manage my world. But that just, wow. And so like cost, resources, quality, stakeholder engagement, communication, like when do we need to communicate with people? When do we need to do it? We're also starting to think about like, how are we going to check stuff? How are we going to know? Like we're nailing down all that stuff. So we're like bringing it all together. So by the time we get done with scope, scheduling, cost, we've dipped our toes in all these other areas, but the runners of the show are these things.
Okay.
And this is the boss.
Yeah.
But sometimes these things trump us.
Okay.
Because I want to do a lot of stuff, but I might not have the time or the money.
Okay.
And all the other process knowledge areas, like, are the things that provide the depth and the understanding to be able to have a schedule that's real.
Okay.
Not a fantasy.
Indeed.
Because once we get into the worlds of like, and this is just like, I don't know how to spell fantasy, fantasy schedules, meaning just like it looks pretty. Like it's hard to know when you look at one of these things and it's like just all these boxes together. It looks the same as everything else. But if it's a fantasy schedule, it ain't worth the paper it's printed off of.
Right.
Because the next thing that happens is you're going to be in meetings every single week, and they're going to tell you how you do and worth it against it. And this person who didn't spend the time to get that planning done has a decision. And it's a decision not to be dramatic that takes their soul and their career into stake. They got a decision to bullshit their way through it or live in truth. And sometimes you get killed.
Yeah.
Because if you've signed up for this thing, boom, and it's not fully whatever, it could be your fault, could be whatever, but there's only one neck to cut, and it's yours. So a lot of people are like, yeah, we're going fine. We're going to figure it out. It's good. We got a great team. Good. Oh, we're doing good. It's green, a little bit yellow. They know how to play the game. And they might get through, but then at the end, Marie Antoinette, like I think she died. Like the head ends up over here. Like, and the body ends up over here. That's not a good place. We want them together. So we want planning to really set us up to go like, dude, we got to figure this out. Dude, we got to figure this out. Let's sit together. Let's see what's reasonable. And sometimes we're put in bad spots, but that's why we're doing all these things. Scope drives the ship. Like other things help and put framing on there, what we can actually do. And then all the other things like attach on to help us get there.
Okay.
And then here's the cool thing. Now the cool thing. Like we got Process Group. I know you just asked me about planning. Let's see what time it is. We got good. We got planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling. We spent all this time setting ourselves up. Setting it up. How do these things, like, what's the relationship?
I mean, they tell us, it informs the other processes, you know, that the plans inform how you'll execute, and the plans inform how you'll monitor and control as you're executing.
Yep. And so it does, think about what the plans were. They were how and what's. So they go like how we're going to execute, how we're going to do those things, and what we're going to execute so that the team has the steps to build the stage.
Right.
And then you nailed this. We're also going to say how, when, like by what mechanism we're going to check, and then like what we're actually going to do. What kind of tests we're going to run, like variance analysis, like, you know, all these different things, EVM stuff, if it's in the neighborhood, like all these different things, like what are we going to do? And then like, what's the reaction? Like, what are we going to do, like to bring it back and adjust?
Okay.
Because we're going to find problems. We're going to be over, like all schedules are wrong from the day they're built, right?
Indeed.
They're wrong. They're models that our best belief right now is that this is what we're going to do. This is the schedule. The beauty of a schedule or a plan is to tell us when we are off the plan. That's the genius. Like, if you don't have a plan, then we can't know, like, we're behind what we thought.
Sure.
Then the natural question is what?
Well, you mean if we don't have a plan?
No. If we have a plan and we determine like, oh, we're either behind it or ahead of it. Like if we're behind it, then we go like
what do we do? How can we fix it? How can we get back on track?
Because if we have a bad plan and we're off of it, we could say like whether we know more.
Right.
Our plan is inaccurate. Like, oh, we know new things. Our core assumptions, that's why we do an assumptions log, are a little bit off. Let's adjust. Then our plan can get changed, because so we set realistic expectations with the people that matter, the world. Like, and then if we want to change the plan, by what means is the only way to do it if it's big?
Just your change control process, integrated change control.
And so that we might like, oh, it's inaccurate. That's like one variant. Or it's like, let's fix this thing. Like, we're off. Like, what can we do? And we go in and we look at it. Like, where are the problems? Where's the root cause? Like, what can we do? We rally the troops, get there. Might need a change request, might not, whatever. But like, how do we fix it? How do we get back to it? Because EVM, I see planning and EVM as cousins. This cousin is just like, I got you, brother, cousin. I'm going to look out for you. I'm going to tell you when you're in trouble. But you got to do something for me. You got to nail down the baseline so that I got something to look at.
Right.
Because you can only tell me if I'm off, tell me if I'm on. So that's what it is. And so, yeah, that's what the planning does. And if we think back to like what you originally started with, it's like, we simplify the whole game down to like how we're going to do it. And that's all those plans, bing, whatever, how. And then like what we're going to do is all the rest of the stuff. And really there's like scope, schedule, cost, risk are the big ones. And then like communication and engagement. I mean, I'm going to draw, and then there's this, and then there's that.
They're all important.
But they're all important. But the big ones are scope, schedule, and cost, and risk. And then all the other ones are like helping along the game.
Okay.
That's the way
Okay.
I kind of think about it. Otherwise,
So,
like the beast takes us over and we're like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
yeah.
So when the questions talk about anything that refers back to affecting scope, schedule, cost, I mean, I know it's not a black and white. Is it always X answer? But is it fair to assume they're looking for change control? We want you to use the process. So it doesn't matter like if it says risk or issue, because I think that's where I get hung up.
Well, it
If
just
it
depends.
says
Like, so it depends on like, is it within the baseline now or is it not?
right
And do we need to tweak it? Because if we
and
see the baseline is
yeah,
like break a bull, but like you got to
mhm,
get in there and crack it. Like, and you don't want to crack
right,
it without like somebody's approval. So like we can crack
right,
it and extend it, but we gotta go through the change
okay,
control process with the CCB, change control
okay.
board. Yeah.
Because I think I get hung up on the verbiage, the words that they use, and not what they're trying to say. So
Mm-hmm.
X factor affects scope, schedule, cost, but we have to do this thing. We need to do this thing to address an issue or address a risk or whatever, and it's going to affect scope, schedule, cost.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think I get hung up in they're not saying exactly what I think they should be saying. Instead of, like I said, using the word risk versus issue. So I know this is off the
You're
planning
doing great. Keep
process,
going.
but we're talking about change and definitely scope, schedule, cost is the big, they're the
Mm-hmm.
big three important baselines. So
Yes, ma'am.
if the question is saying, hey, this action is going to affect the schedule or the
Mm-hmm.
cost, then you have to collect the information. What
Yep.
what
Analyze it,
exactly are
stuff
we
like that.
doing? What's the effect? And then go through integrated change control.
Yeah. And like, so the
Okay.
natural question, like the reason, like, why is it important that we do that in this type of environment? Why have they set that mechanism, that system up so that there's a change control board for those kind of situations? Why?
So things don't just happen, and get out of control. Especially, scope creep can be real easy to go, hey, let's just add this one little extra piece of functionality.
Mm-hmm.
And then next thing you know, oh, but then it can do this. And oh, but and there you go, you've got a
Mm-hmm.
monster.
Then it takes over because like you're in the fight, like
Yep.
you know stuff and
Mhm.
you're best to see it, but you're leveraging somebody else and you're
Right,
hoping that they make the best decision, right? So in
right.
Agile, it's the product owner who gets the
Yeah.
call. Here, it's the change control board, different process.
Yep.
Similar kind of mechanism in a sense. Reach out to us. You can email me at scott@PMmasterPrep.com. You can call me, text me, or you can go on the website, hit the Accelerator application button, and get in there and get some help. All right, so good lesson. Talk to you later. Adios, muchachos.